Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mandeep from GNDU Amritsar. Today we are going to talk on the module Fiscal Policy from the paper Business Environment. After the completion of this module, you will be able to understand what's the concept of fiscal policy, various objectives relating to that, the basics of fiscal policy, particularly in India, and interpret the terminology relating to fiscal policy in India. The government policy relating to public debt, expenditure, and taxation, etc., is known as fiscal policy. So, fiscal policy is basically the aggregate demand curve shift due to tax uses, government transfers, or goods and services purchases by the government. According to the Keynes in the 30s, through fiscal measures, the government can influence business activities. Fiscal policy, or also known as budgetary policy, is the most important instrument through which the government intervenes in the economy. So this is one of the important tools to combat recession or inflation and even to accelerate the economic growth. There are alternations in the taxation and spending policy of the government through the various legislations. So let's talk about the definition of fiscal policy given by various authors. As per G.K. Shaw, fiscal policy includes any design to change the price level, composition, or timing of the government expenditure, or to vary the burden structure of the frequency of the tax payment. As per Otto, fiscal policy is changes in the tax and expenditure which aim at short-run goals of full employment, price level, and stability. Moreover, Harvey and Johnson defined fiscal policy as the changes in the government expenditure as well as taxation designed to influence the pattern and level of activity. Now, basically, there are two kinds of fiscal policy. One is expansionary, another is contractionary. Now, expansionary fiscal policy is that kind of fiscal policy when aggregate demand is increased by the government through tax cuts in order to increase the disposable income of the consumers, and it is basically used at the time of recession. Now, coming back to the other one, that is contractionary fiscal policy, it is when the efforts of the government are to decrease the aggregate demand in order to decrease the disposable income of the consumer. So the taxes are increased, and this is basically used at the time of inflation. Objectives of the fiscal policy. The governments all over the world formulate the fiscal policy in order to attain the objectives of welfare state establishment, foreign trade promotion, full employment achievement, promotion of investments which are already socially desirable, and to achieve the rapid economic development and more income inequality reduction. Growth preference of economy. Mainly two types of growth performance increased by foreign policy. Firstly, through resource mobilization, growth is influenced. Secondly, resource allocation efficiency improves and it influences the growth. For resource mobilization, tax efforts are well done in India. Although government has to show some income in agriculture, but it is out of the purview of tax. If entire black money is converted into white money, then India's growth will be boosted and more jobs will be created for the educated youth. Generation of non-tax revenue, current government expenditure restriction and public sector enterprise surplus is raising are other important aspects of resource mobilization in India. Special incentives are provided to encourage investment in specific areas like housing for saving through fiscal policy. Inability to prevent growth of black money in India is a failure of fiscal policy. Due to tax evasion, government has suffered heavy losses and black money quantified as a result. There is case when the savings are low down due to the black money generation as consumption is on luxury services. Fiscal policy and allocation efficiency is another objective. Through allocation of resources, fiscal policy influences growth performance. Tax policy is the most important determinant of efficiency. At central government level, customs and excise duties, and at state level, sales tax or VAT play an important role. Through restrictive controls by custom duties, protection is provided to the number of industries in the recent years. Although, as per the recommendations of Chalia Committee, import duties lowered down and unwarranted protection to industries was withdrawn. Third objective is fiscal policy is necessary to mobilize resources. Budget. It's a complete picture of the government for the year related to the estimated expenditures and receipts. It includes the previous 2 years' budget figures also. Actually, in a budget, figures of the 3 years are included, that is, following year, budget estimates, current year, revised and budget figures, and preceding year actual figures. For instance, 2015-16 budget estimates include the year 13-14 and 14-15, along with the 15-16 estimates. Social justice to the people. In the developing country like India, in order to accelerate economic development, taxation system, expenditure of the government and borrowings play a vital role. There are vast human and material resources in an economy which are underutilized. Such type of countries are lacking in communication and transportation system, roads connectivity, irrigation and power, etc., which means they have a weak infrastructure. Hence, for economic growth, sources need mobilization, especially in the public sector. There should be incentives to save and invest so as to promote economic growth through private sector. In order to ensure price stability, inflation pressure controlled, and there must be fair distribution of income and wealth in the economy. So, main objective of fiscal policy in India is to ensure social justice to the people and to improve growth preference of the economy. There are various techniques of fiscal policy: public taxation, public expenditure, deficit financing, and public debt. And these are used in order to adopt the fiscal policy. Now, what is this public taxation policy? As we know that the taxes are levied by the state and central government in every country. So there are basically two kinds of taxes, direct as well as indirect. The direct taxes are imposed on the corporate as well as individuals, and they become the major part of revenue of the government. But on capital goods, transfer of income, wealth, property, direct taxes are imposed, whereas the indirect taxes are basically excise duty, service tax, custom duty, value added taxes, etc., since they are not imposed directly on the consumer. The purpose of the taxes is not only the collection of revenue, but also it brings down the income and wealth inequalities. It prevents the wealth concentration in the few hands and also diverts the capital to the desirable sectors. Next comes public expenditure policy. The expenditure of the government may be revenue in nature or capital in nature. Developmental and non-development expenditure is another kind of classification given by the government. There may be state or central level expenditure. So the expenditure on the social and community services, economic services, is basically comes under the category of developmental expenditure. Whereas the non-development expenditures are expenditures on the payment of pensions, interest payments and defense, etc. Non-plan expenditure is rising in the country since the last few years. because of the more expenditure on the payment of interest, general services, subsidies, and defense. So, this is basically a large part of non plan expenditure. Over the years, due to the public debt, growth, and other liabilities, central government tax burden is bound to increase. Due to growing tensions with the other countries like China, Pakistan, etc., defense expenditure also increased. Subsidies are given by the central government to the needy on the basis of food, fertilizers, which is one of the important part of the expenditure. The expenditure on the collection of taxes, police pensions, etc., that is also rising every year due to change in or the hike in wages and salaries. So the central government also grants assistance to the various state governments and union territories in case of any natural calamities. Although central government has the main objective of economic development and also for the establishment of welfare state, still defense expenditure has grown over the years. Every year it is going to increase. For the development and other needs, interest payments, etc., has become very large, and it has become a proportionately large part of this expenditure due to the borrowings from the market, financial institutions, and banks. Reason is for the development purposes, infrastructure purposes. Although the interest payments, which are the part of the debt services, is under the non-plan expenditure, this is taking or making a good contribution to the economic development of the country. Next one comes deficit financing policy. When the government for the public sector plan in the developing economy fails to mobilize the resources from the external and internal domestic sources, the deficit financing becomes a necessity. It is a necessary evil. Alternatively, the government can slash the demand for investable funds by cutting the size of the plan, although it may affect the growth. Hence, a choice has to be made between inflationary price and lowering the growth rate in the developing economy. Obviously, lower growth rate is a bigger evil as compared to the rise in price. Deficit financing. There was a gap in overall budget up to the mid 80s between the expenditure and receipts together in the capital and revenue accounts. So deficit financing in India is used to fill this gap, and the borrowings are availed from RBI against issue of treasury bills, and accumulated cash balances are used. Government transfers its securities to Reserve Bank of India when the borrowings made from RBI, and then securities are transferred to the bank and more notes are issued circulated on behalf of the government. Now, what are the consequences of this deficit financing? In the developed economy, during depression phase, deficit financing play a very important role. General public and banks don't undertake investment risk, and the level of expenditure comes down and idle cash balances preferred. Due to deficiency in aggregate demand, there is a lack in incentive to produce, although capital equipment and machinery is available. So, the level of effective demand may increase through deficit financing by the government, which pumps additional purchasing power in the economy. The unused capital equipment and machinery will come into operation to meet the demand. Accordingly, production level will increase if in relation to aggregate spending level there will be no generation of inflationary tendencies. There are different conditions in underdeveloped countries because capital equipment is built up there as it does not exist already. As a result of deficit financing, there's an increase in purchasing power of people because the new money is created. But simultaneously, goods production is not increased to that level. There is a time lag between consumer goods availability and generation of extra purchasing power. Food consumption level is low due to poverty of masses. Hence, an increase in income is the first priority is to spend more on consumption of food. In short time, food supply can't be increased. Although, by adopting new agriculture techniques and implementation of land reform, supply can be increased in the longer run. Hence, price rise will be there as the demand for food items will be high as compared to its supply. Thus, a food price rise is a signal for other items price rise in the developing economy. The inflationary impact may be restricted if additional created money supply is matched with the increased amount of consumption of goods and deficit financing resources used for consumption goods production. Although in a developing economy, main task is not to increase consumption of goods or output, but it is capital equipment building. Build up thermal and hydraulic power plants, railway tracks and communication facilities, etc. Hence, deficit financing gives the extra money generation which is spent upon these projects. In near future, consumer goods increase will be less and it would raise inflation level. Public debt of India. Government also raises debt like of institutions and individuals. Public debt may be in the form of internal debt and external debt. These debts, which are meant for public use, are also called the government debt. Like other governments, Indian government has been borrowing with certain conditions and limits. The debt raised may be internal or external. Loans raised from foreign governments and bodies are the external debt, while in the form of treasury bills and special securities issued to RBI and market borrowing comes under internal debt. During British times, the borrowings were for the war purposes only. But during the post-independence period in India, the borrowings are made for economic development too. In the initial stages, borrowing were for financing of development schemes. Later, government was forced to borrow for the current revenue expenditure even. In addition to public debt, Government of India raises funds from the general public through Provident Fund and small saving schemes, etc. Now, under the public debt of India, states' public debt crisis comes. In the last few years, state governments were unable to undertake certain necessary expenditure on social activities. Reason: heavy public debt and large interest payments. State governments were forced to pay high rates of interest and unable to maintain infrastructure, public health, sanitation, education, and other services. State government's expenditure on salaries and pensions is increasing, which is actually responsible for states' public debt. When the state governments raise funds from international bodies, maybe World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc., they are charged higher interest rates as compared to the central government. States' power to borrow for commercial banks, financial institutions, and markets are also curtailed by central government. Hence, growing debt burden of central and state governments is a serious concern. There's a suggestion that central government should raise loans by itself and disburse them to states as per their requirements, as loans and funds to the central government are available even at the lower rates. Central government's revenue and expenditure. Central government expenditure, revenue expenditure of the central government is increasing day by day, and tremendous increase is since the year 87-88. We can classify these expenditures into three kinds. One is a civil expenditure, in which the economic services, social and community services, grants in aid for the development purposes to the states and union territories is included. The second one is that the central government's defense expenditure, which is related to the army personnel and even the retired army personnel's pensions. The third kind is the expenditure which is related to the taxes and duties collection, pension and retirement benefits, even the interest payments and other grants to the states, etc. A new classification was given to the central government budget since year 1987-88. As per this classification, public expenditure was, especially this central government public expenditure was classified into two parts. One is the non-plan, another is the plan expenditure. Now, the non-plan expenditure was again divided into revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure is the financing which is done by the revenue receipts, for example, taxes and non-taxes revenue. And revenue expenditure includes the defense services, subsidies on the food, fertilizers to the farmers, other subsidies like debt relief to the farmers, even the pensions given to the general public and the police, we can say old age people, and the general services which are rendered for the collection of taxes, even external affairs and interest payments, etc. Secondly, it also includes the agriculture, transportation, communication, even the power, science and technology, etc., which are a part of economic service. Moreover, the social services, that is the services rendered to the general public in the form of health services and education services, etc. Another part of this is the grants given to the foreign governments, even the states and union territories of the country, like the public enterprises loans, foreign government loans, capital expenditure, even on defense, and the loans to the other state governments. Capital expenditure. Capital expenditure includes defense capital expenditure, general services capital expenditure, social and community development capital expenditure, capital expenditure on economic development for the financing of plan project loans to union territories and loans to the foreign governments. Now, it includes planned expenditure, which is another important expenditure of central government, and it is composed of central plan on irrigation and flood control, industry, energy, agriculture, rural development, science and technology, environment and social services, etc., and also assistance for plans of the central government to union territories and states. Central government's revenue receipts. Like many countries, the central government revenue in India is increasing. Per capita income and national income and government revenue sources are growing. Tax receipts have been increased in the combination, although central government revenue is rising fast as compared to the state government revenue due to the reason that taxes imposed by central government in form of excise duties, corporation tax, custom duties and excise duties are productively high and even are elastic in nature. Central government's personal income tax at one moment of time was most important single tax of the government, followed by custom duties. In the present era, corporation tax is the most important source of revenue, which is followed by central excise duties, personal income tax and custom duties. Central government's capital receipts. Central government's capital receipts include non-market borrowings, that is, gross borrowings less repayments. State governments, union territories, and public sector enterprises loans, net recoveries, net small saving collection, and other capital receipts, which include special deposits and provident funds. Next is central government expenditure trends. Public expenditure trends in India are changing after independence because of the planning and welfare state objectives of the government. Before independence, public expenditure was comparatively small. Due to World War, public expenditure increased. There was a rapid increase in public expenditure of the government after the post-war period due to the introduction of planning provision for welfare services. Defense and civil administration of the country were the motives of British government before independence. Hence, these services comprise of large part of expenditure of central and state governments at the time. After independence, Developmental expenditure has increased due to economic growth objective and even due to security reasons. Defense expenditure is increasing. Democratic institutions working like parliament, defense commitments, administration expansion, international commitments of government, nation building activities like health and education has increased the revenue expenditure of central government. Non-developmental expenditure comprises of large part of total expenditure, which includes administrative expenses, debt services, and defense services, which keeps non-development expenditure to the higher scale. Now, revenue account or revenue budget. In India, budget is divided into two parts, that is, revenue account or capital account. The taxation receipts, the receipts from non-tax sources and expenditures out of these sources are taken into the revenue budget. The tax revenue comprises of income and expenditure taxes, property taxes, commodity and service taxes. Non-tax revenue includes current coinage and mint, dividends, receipts from the interest, and other non-tax revenues. The revenue expenditure is related to economic services like trade, transportation, agriculture and industry, community and social services like medical, public health, education, etc. General services like judiciary, police, and defense are also part of this. Now let's talk about state government's revenue and expenditure, because every state government is granted certain amount in every budget, that how much amount they can spend and how much revenue they can receive. So state government's revenue expenditure. States are required to maintain law and order situation in their states, and in addition to that, they have to involve in various activities for the nation building, maybe public health, medicine, irrigation, agriculture, education, and other welfare activities of the people. Because it is said that welfare state building is the main motive of any state government. Hence, agriculture and industrial productivity is required to be increased so that the needs of the poor people are kept into the mind and they are to be fulfilled. Ultimately, there is always an increase every year in the expenditure of the states. There are certain non-development expenditure of the states too. This kind of expenditure is in the form of the pensions, may be given to the army personnel, may be given to the old person, may be given to the widows, and other miscellaneous general services and administrative services, interest payments related to the debt raised by them, and even the fiscal services, which comprise of the collection of taxes and duty. Whenever they have to collect the taxes and duty, they have to render and pay certain amount for that, that is in the form of expenses. Police, judiciary and jails are the matters related to the internal security, and it is also the responsibility of the state government. There may be the problems in the states due to communal disturbances. Any state can have that. And in the previous year, we have seen that in many states there were communal disturbances right from the 80s. Industrial disputes can be the part. Hence, the special police forces are to be set up to deal with law and order issues. So the non-development expenditures like the pensions, etc., another is a burden on the state expenditure. Even for the district administration, funds are to be utilized by the state governments. Developmental expenditure of states. It may be an expenditure on social and community services, which may be related to education, public health, family planning, natural calamities, and social securities, etc. On front of economic services, the expenditure of the state may include irrigation, rural and community developmental projects, industries like minerals and agriculture, etc. Next come state governments and current revenue. In order to meet the revenue expenditure, the revenue is collected by central government in India. It may be in the form of states' own taxes, or the contribution and grants in aid from the central government and non-tax revenue of the states. Any state's tax revenue consists of two parts. One is state tax revenue, which is the composition of taxes on income, property tax, capital transaction tax, and tax on services and commodities. Second is central taxes, share. Non-tax revenue of the state is in the form of receipts from interest, profits, services of the general nature like state lotteries, social and economic services. State government depend upon the central government for their share of taxes. In addition, state governments, on the basis of the recommendations of the Finance Commission, receive grants from the central government. Grants are for central plan schemes and state plan schemes consisting of grants of even non-plan nature, natural calamities grant and statutory grants. Now let's discuss the income from states' taxes. Professional tax and tax on agricultural income are revenue generation sources for any state government. These are the taxes levied and imposed by the state government. Then the tax revenue generation of state is also from the property and capital transaction. These may be in the form of land revenue, which always varies from state to state. Although due to the failure of crops, production in some areas, land revenue may be waived off. There is an inequitable distribution of land revenue as it falls heavily on small farmers as compared to the bigger ones. On transfer of property, registration fee and stamp duty occupy a major position, and it is increasing day by day due to property dealings in large scale. Although, in order to escape stamp duty, the property transactions are undervalued by some state governments, urban immovable property is also charged to tax. On commodities and services, taxes of the state government also appear. The commodity taxes may be in the form of excise duty of the states, motor vehicle taxes, environment taxes, electrical duty and VAT, etc. In case of state sales tax, which is replaced by now value added tax, it's an important source of revenue. On sales and purchase of goods, the state government have been given the power during interstate trade, but these tax proceeds are retained and collected by the states in which interstate goods movement commences. On alcoholic liquors, narcotics, etc., excise duty is levied by the state governments. These duties are charged when the drugs are produced in the state or from other state they enter into the jurisdiction of the particular state. From one state to another, these duties vary. In some states, there is prohibition of liquor, and these states lose heavy revenue in the form of these duties. Additional excise duties are charged at special rates on sales of goods during interstate trade, for example, fabrics, tobacco, and sugar, etc. During movement of goods in interstate, trade taxes are collected and retained by the central government. State government's revenue trends. After independence, states were not so responsible as far as financial receipts and expenditure matters are concerned. So RBI converted payments to the states in the form of loans due to huge imbalances which were earlier created by state governments, as they were highly dependent upon center for the resources. With the passage of time, there was an increase in state government's revenue, like central government funds, requirements of the states increased due to population increase and responsibilities enhancement. Hence, old taxes were raised with the imposition of new taxes. The service tax and commodity tax is one of the important tax revenue of the state governments. Certain taxes are shared between central and state government, although they are collected and imposed by the central government only. Now let's discuss the limitations of the present fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has achieved a great success in developed countries, but in developing countries, a partial success has been achieved. Fiscal policy in developing countries has certain limitations. For example, a successful fiscal policy cannot be implemented due to narrow and rigid tax structure, while integration taxation policy can be helpful for the growth. Moreover, there is inadequate information of statistics related to expenditure, income, employment, and other variables. Hence, it is difficult to formulate a realistic fiscal policy. For the proper implementation of fiscal policy, general public cooperation is required. But people are not in a position to understand the importance of fiscal policy as majority of them are illiterate. Even the fiscal policy in India is not properly implemented as the tax evasion is by the people, and government is not in a position to collect proper funds for the implementation of developmental projects. Due to different political parties, fiscal policy move in different direction and welfare of people is ignored as the parties have their own agendas to complete. Even due to defective tax structure in India, fiscal policy has failed to provide suitable results as government has failed to raise productivity of direct taxes and indirect taxes. Relevance is more. In India, fiscal policy has failed to reduce the inequality in the distribution of income and wealth due to tax evasion by the people. Even fiscal policy in India has failed to control inflation as public expenditure on non-developmental activities and deficit financing has raised demand, pull inflation, and due to indirect taxes, cost push inflation is promoted. So let's summarize what we have learnt in this module. Planning Commission in the 7th plan mentioned that through fiscal policy, government creates and sustains public economy consisting of the provisions of public services and public investment at some time. It is an instrument for reallocation of the resources according to the national priorities, redistribution, promotion of private savings and investment, and maintenance of the stability. So by means of fiscal policy, social justice is ensured to the people and the growth preference of the economy is improved. So fiscal policy is an important instrument through which the government promotes economic development, which is the key to success. And in the era of rapid economic development, developing economies may suffer from the capital deficiency. Hence, capital formation needs more emphasis, which requires more savings. Hence, it may be concluded that since independence, central government expenditure is affected by the two factors, that is, to make a pace of economic development in the country and to keep the security concerns up to date. Although in the recent year, general administration and subsidies constitute a bigger part of the central government expenditure. Thank you.